Perhaps the most misunderstood nutrient out there is potassium.
When we think about soil tests and plant tissue tests, a lot of times they don't jive, Brian, and I would say this leads to a lot of misunderstanding. Like for example, this field right here, if we look at a potassium soil test in the parts per million, it's gonna say high. We're in the high range, and that leads us to believe when potassium prices are pretty high, we'd say, if I'm gonna cut back somewhere, this soil tests pretty high in potassium, maybe I'll cut back here.
But here's the problem. In a lot of cases, potassium out in fields is not in a good form that's available for plants. It's in the form of a rock. And how quickly does rock break down and become available to your crop? Not very fast. The other issue that we've got in a lot of the Midwest is we have very high levels of calcium. We have very high levels of magnesium. Well, if you've got very high levels of calcium and magnesium and only kind of moderately high levels of potassium, that potassium just isn't going to get into the plant at the rate that it should. So even though a lot of soil tests will say high in parts per million, the appropriate test that a farmer should look at is base saturation.
When it comes to base saturation, it's a ratio of 5 nutrients. It's calcium and magnesium, as Brian has talked about, and potassium, of course, that's our topic today, but also sodium and hydrogen. When we look at those 5 nutrients, it gives us a indication of the holding sites in our soil and what's on them. And if we see a lot of those holding sites tied up with the calcium and magnesium, that doesn't leave a lot of room for the potassium.
So with the potassium number, what we want to see is in the range of 4% to 8% potassium. If we're seeing numbers like 1 or 2 or even 3% potassium, what's most likely going to happen is, yes, you probably have some potassium in your soil, but not enough is getting into the plant. And so when you go and do plant tissue analysis next year, and what we always suggest to guys is do it over a period of time. Do it for 8 or 10 weeks in a row in one particular spot in the field, and you'll most likely find that your potassium levels are going to be low to deficient.
One of the things with soybeans that they need is high amounts of potassium, even more so than what a 200 bushel corn crop needs. 60 bushel beans need a lot of potassium. So if you want to get there to 60 or 80 or even more bushels on soybeans, you have to have a lot of potassium that's available for your crop. With, as Brian was mentioning, potassium in the form of a rock, it's not going to release quick enough. And with soybeans, once we get into August, they're really starting to put on pods. They're pulling lots of nutrition in to pack into that nutrient-dense seed. And potassium is one of the most important things. And we just can't draw enough potassium out of a lot of these soils quickly enough to do that. That's why our soybean yields are suffering, where corn is pulling a little bit of potassium all the way through the year. So even if we don't have a lot of available potassium that will come available in a single day, for example, since we need a little bit all year long, we can still have a successful corn crop in some of those situations.
So here's the whole thing. We know that potassium fertilizer is expensive. In our opinion, it's way too expensive. I think it's ridiculous. Potassium or potash should be half, if not even 1/3 the price that it is today. But nevertheless, it is what it is. It costs what it does. So you have to say, all right, how many dollars do I really need to invest in this particular fertilizer or in any fertilizer? So that's the reason why we do soil tests, the reason why we do plant tissue analysis. We want to find out, are you actually short on potassium or not? And don't just listen to people that'll say, well, you have X number of parts per million, you're good. That's not enough. You need to do base saturation tests for soil tests. You need to do plant tissue analysis and find out what your crop really needs. All I can tell you is that on our farm, when we've taken more dollars on our fertilizer budget and put towards potassium, we've increased our yields. And we've helped a lot of other farmers do that across the Midwest. Potassium is the most deficient major nutrient for most farmers, is what we found across the Midwest. So you can put potassium out in the fall. We do a fair amount of dry potassium, dry potash. We like putting potassium a little bit deeper in the ground than a lot of guys. We want to get our levels good all the way down to 12 inches, if not even deeper. The other thing we want you to consider is doing some liquid potassium in the spring, right in the furrow, doing it also in a 2x2. Get multiple forms of potassium out there. Get lots more potassium out there so your crop isn't suffering from lack of this major nutrient.
Now with potassium, we like to put it down deeper. We're typically in our strip till situation putting potassium down about 8 or 10 inches deep. What we're seeing is corn plants and other crops are pulling that potassium out. A lot of it goes up into the stalk. And where we've got good levels of potassium availability, we're getting a much better standing crop. A lot of times when we see issues with corn that's lodgy, the first thing that we'll blame is the hybrid, but the first thing I look at is what's your potassium program? Are you getting enough potassium out there? Because if we're short, that's where a lot of times we see spindly stalks that don't really stand up until fall.
Well, once again, we think that it's very important if you want to have great yields that you really focus on this potassium thing and don't just look at parts per million, look at base saturation test, and then also do some plant tissue analysis as you go throughout the year. I know you may not have ever done it before, but it's really important if you want to have a good idea where you best need to invest your fertilizer dollars.
Well, speaking of investments, if you have our Weed of the Week, you definitely need to invest in a good control program. We'll show you how to stop it coming up right after this.